Welcome to Case in Point, produced by the University of Pennsylvania Law School. I'm your host, Felicia Lynn. Today we'll be talking with Professor Stephen Morse, the Ferdinand Wakeman Hubbell Professor of Law, Professor of Psychology and Law and Psychiatry, and the Associate Director of the Center for Neuroscience and Society here at Penn. In the wake of the recent mass shooting in Las Vegas, we'll be speaking with Professor Morse about whether or how the interconnected fields of neuroscience, psychiatry, and the law may be able to help predict or prevent such tragedies from occurring. So sadly, we find ourselves turning to you once again in the aftermath of another mass shooting here in the United States. Earlier this week, in the beginning of October, 58 people were killed, over 500 injured in Las Vegas by a man shooting from the 32nd floor of a hotel into a large crowd of concert goers. So, as this is just in a string of mass shootings in this country, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the size of this problem and our ability to predict the next one.
Right. First of all, thank you for having me. This was an awful tragedy. The research literature refers to these as mass killings. And a mass killing is usually defined as, in one episode, at least 4 people are either injured or killed. Some researchers put the cutoff at 3, but the more common cutoff is 4. These come in 2 different varieties. One variety would be those that one might describe as clearly motivated by some sort of dispute. A gang dispute, a drug dispute, a neighborhood conflict, or something of the sort. Interestingly enough, although those 2 are pretty infrequent, they're not really infrequent. Those are actually pretty common in the United States. What we're talking about when we're talking about Stephen Paddock in Las Vegas is we're talking about a very distinguishable class of events. These are what I would call largely solo killings done for no motive that involves the victim themselves. These are stranger killings for some other reason. These are extremely rare. And the truth about predictive technology generally is, unless you have a very, very sensitive instrument, that is, some kind of predictive tool that virtually always gets it right and doesn't have many cases of what we call false positives, where you predict the event's going to occur and it doesn't. Unless you have a very, very, very sensitive instrument, you cannot predict low frequency, very low frequency events with any degree of accuracy. And any tool you use that might, in fact, include a person who actually would do it is going to sweep in a zillion people who fit the same profile but wouldn't do it. And so effectively, at present, there is no way, even with the best technologies now available, effectively and accurately in a cost-benefit justified way to predict these very, very, very unusual events accurately.
So even without the ability to predict necessarily, is there a set or a common motivation that runs through some of the shooters? Now I'm talking just in the second category of mass killings that you're mentioning here, the non-dispute resolution type. Is there a common set of motivations here?
Actually, no. If we look across at the commonalities, the most profound commonality is, with only one exception I can think of, San Bernardino, they're all males. And San Bernardino, it was not a solo female. She had a male accomplice. The only counterexample I can think of generally is perhaps suicide bombers, female suicide bombers in the Middle East, and they're quite rare too. In most cases, they're younger. I mean, mostly they're middle-aged or considerably younger. Paddock is an exception. He was 64 years old. He's not a young man. By the way, the focus on males and younger is what we see with violent criminality anyhow. Males, and especially young males, are disproportionately more likely to engage in violent criminal conduct. When it comes to the motivations, they're extremely various. In a few cases, there was clearly the involvement of major mental disorder. One thinks of Sandy Hook, one thinks of Aurora, and those cases are actually rare because, in general, people with major mental disorder are no more dangerous than the general population. But then you have an assortment of other sorts of motives. In some cases, it's clearly political. Think of Anders Breivik. the young ultranationalist in Norway who killed 77 people, 8 with a bomb and 69 by shooting. In some cases, it's political religious. Think of the people in San Bernardino or the guy at the army base. In other cases, it's really unknown. And Paddock is a mystery. He is a mystery. I think as we learn more about him, more will come out. But I think it's all going to be speculative. He had no criminal history. He had no mental health history. He was an unobtrusive neighbor for the most part. And now there obviously was some motivation, but we don't know what it is. So it's really a grab bag.
Well, let's then take a step back. Your work is in the interconnected field of law and neuroscience. So where are we in understanding those connections of connecting the criminal acts and the brain? For Las Vegas in particular, is it something that you think is a mental health issue potentially interfering with a person's ability to make rational decisions? Is it an interference in your ability to know right from wrong? Where do those two areas meet?
Okay, the way you finally described the issue, it's not so much a question of neuroscience. Whether a person has the capacity for rationality is a behavioral evaluation. Whether the person knows right from wrong is a psychological, behavioral evaluation. Now, obviously, the brain is always involved in all our behavior. But for the law, we're most concerned with, if you will, the psychological level. What were the person's reasons for action? How well were they able to regulate their behavior? How rational are they? Now, at this point, we don't know about Paddock. And just by looking at his brain, because I'm assuming he's going to get an autopsy, just by looking at his brain, we're not going to be able to determine whether he was capable of rationality, whether he was someone who knew right from wrong, et cetera, et cetera. Now notice, this was a very carefully planned, premeditated killing. Even premeditation so exquisitely done is not inconsistent with having a major mental disorder. In fact, many people who kill as a result of the kind of thinking that mental disorder has altered are able carefully to plan their conduct, but they're acting for reasons that are clearly disordered. We don't know if that will be true. Well, we'll never know if that was true unless evidently his companion is able to tell us, but we're certainly not going to know it at the level of the brain, because the brain doesn't tell us anything about the content of people's thinking. It may tell us something about how regions that are associated with behavior were potentially influenced. But even then, it's going to be underdeterminative, because almost any brain finding you have is going to have heterogeneous outcomes. That is, people with frontal damage may be entirely rational, and people with no frontal damage may be irrational, or at least any frontal damage we can measure. At this point, the brain science, frankly, doesn't teach us very much. And about these extremely infrequent events, my sense is at this point it tells us almost nothing. Let me give a counterexample to my own point. You may recall from many decades ago, a man named Charles Whitman went up to the top of the University of Texas Tower in Austin with rifles, and he killed, I think, 31 people. On autopsy, it was discovered that he had a lesion that was very near his amygdala, which is a structure associated with basically emotion. It does many things, which is true of most brain regions, by the way. But in his case, it was near the amygdala. Whether it was actually pressing on the amygdala in a way that would have had an effect, we don't know. But there was, in his case, a sort of escalating level of anger on his part. And whether it was the amygdala or whether it was just psychological deterioration, we don't know. But there was psychological deterioration, and maybe the amygdala was involved. But that's kind of a one-off case. If you look in the literature, the neuroscience doesn't answer the questions we need answered. And ultimately, actions speak louder than images. Sure. If there's a disjunct between what you see on the image and what you see in the behavior, cases of malingering aside, we always have to believe the behavior. And the law is concerned with behavior. There are no brain criteria in the law.
So what do you think that investigators or other policing, policymakers, et cetera, what can others do, what can they learn from what's happened in Las Vegas to better understand why it's happened?
Well, let's assume we throw all the money in the world at the problem. This guy evidently led a very unconventional life. I mean, that's what people are saying, unconventional, and they use other words like that. Does that mean there was something wrong with him? Who knows? Let's assume we do a fabulous psychological autopsy, as it's sometimes called. That's a term used in the suicide literature. And we really put together a wonderful profile of what were the variables that seemed to be the pathway to him deciding to do this dreadful deed. Okay, what's going to be true is it's going to be at a level of generality that it's going to fit a zillion people. Now I say a zillion, I'm overstating obviously. So yes, it's nice to know, and I suppose at some point it may be helpful, but it's not going to help us a lot, and it's not going to help us to predict. So you asked me, what can we do? Well, let's be really concrete about this. We couldn't have predicted it. That is true. There was no real prevention measure. I suppose perhaps there could have been better screening at the hotel. How did they miss it that he had this arsenal in the room? But do we want to turn hotels into busybodies? I don't think we want to do that. You know, certainly not to pick out the one in a zillion case. What do we know? We know that assault rifles, especially fully automatic assault rifles, are incredibly lethal. Now, handguns are lethal. Knives are lethal. Hunting rifles are lethal. Shotguns are lethal, but they don't compare to assault rifles. Now, I don't see any reason, hold aside all the other Second Amendment questions you might have. And here I'm with the police chiefs of America. I don't see any reason why citizens should be entitled to own assault weapons. These are not sport weapons. They're not hunting weapons. Now, could we ban them entirely? Yes. Would it work entirely? No. A dedicated person who is bound and determined. Look at Anders Breivik, where Norway has such incredible gun control, and he was able to get his hands on what he wanted. Would a dedicated person be able to get his hands on an assault rifle? Probably. But certainly if we ban them, and if we enforce that ban, it is going to be much more difficult for people to get them, and it's not going to ultimately prevent it, but it certainly will prevent the most lethal weapons from easily coming into the hands of people who might use them for the wrong purposes.
And here the reports are even that he modified his semi-automatic weapons to create an automatic weapon, and
That's
I
right.
think the discussion is turning to whether even just that the ability to modify should be something that legislators can do.
Yes, they can deal with that. Now, the interesting thing is, this guy was able to pass every record check. I mean, he could have gotten handguns. He could have gotten a hunting rifle. You just don't have that degree of lethality. I mean, it's a whole different ballgame.
Yes.
So that is my most concrete and practical suggestion.
So we started off this conversation kind of differentiating these large mass killings that seem to capture public attention from the other kinds of homicidal crime that's occurring in this country. Do these larger mass killings in any way deflect attention from that growing problem of homicides across the country?
Well, as everyone knows, violent crime in the United States has radically decreased since the high water mark in the middle to late 80s, including homicide. But it is the case, although this is unevenly distributed across America, more in some cities than in others, it is still the case that homicide each of the last 2 years is up about 20% in the United States. Now, the number of people killed in some of the biggest cities just in the last 2 years by sort of, if you will, everyday gun violence, and that's a terrible phrase, but it's just a description of the reality, swamps the number of people that have been killed in these mass shootings. This is much greater carnage. Now, this is a very, very complicated problem, as we know, with variables from so many levels of explanation about what is a cause of the homicide in the United States, how to prevent it, and the like. But my hypothesis, just a hypothesis, I have no good data to support this, is that focusing on these high salient, very unusual events does deflect our attention from what's going on. Now, there are some other differences that really need to be pointed to. Who are the killers and who are the victims in the sort of everyday homicide cases are not the same sort of people that are doing the killing and that are typically the victims in these very unique mass killing situations involving strangers. I think we need to pay vastly more attention in our society to the everyday and not so much to these highly unique situations that are not predictable, that are not preventable, etc. And so, yes, I do think it's a deflection, and I think it's a shame.
Well, thank you for taking the time to join us for this fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on this episode of Case in Point.